California's most dangerous fault junction just moved, and scientists are watching it more closely than almost anything else in the state right now. A magnitude 4.2 earthquake struck the exact spot where two of the most closely studied fault lines on the planet physically collide, and that specific location hasn't produced an earthquake this strong in at least 26 years. On its own, a 4.2 is nothing. It rattles dishes, wakes people up, and passes. But this one didn't happen just anywhere. It happened at an address seismologists have been watching for decades, and understanding what sits underneath it is going to change how you think about the next major earthquake heading for California. If you want to stay on top of seismic developments like this one, subscribe now, because I cover breaking earthquake activity almost every single day. Let's break it down, starting with exactly what happened. Early on the morning of July 12, 2026, at around 3:30 a.m. local time, a magnitude 4.2 earthquake struck close to Fraser Park, California, roughly 70 miles north of Los Angeles. The quake originated at a depth of about 13 kilometers, and the shaking was felt widely across Southern California, reaching communities as far as Santa Clarita, Palmdale, and even parts of Los Angeles and Orange counties. USGS Shake Alert activated the moment the quake struck, giving people a brief warning before the shaking arrived. No injuries or significant damage have been reported. Some early readings placed the magnitude slightly differently depending on the source, ranging from about 4.1 up to a revised 4.4, as additional stations reported in, which is completely normal and doesn't change anything about where this quake happened to strike. For anyone unfamiliar with the geography, Fraser Park sits up in the mountains along the Interstate 5 corridor, right around the Kearney County line, an area many Southern California drivers pass through without a second thought on their way between Los Angeles and the Central Valley. It's exactly the kind of quiet, unremarkable location that rarely makes headlines, which is precisely what makes this earthquake stand out to anyone who understands what sits directly underneath it. Now, on its own, a magnitude 4.2 earthquake is nothing unusual for California. Thousands of earthquakes strike this state every year, and the vast majority are far too small for anyone to notice. Only around 15 to 20 earthquakes reach magnitude 4.0 or greater in a typical year. In North America, only Alaska experiences more recorded earthquakes annually than California does, which gives you some sense of just how seismically active this stretch of the country really is on an ordinary basis. So why does this one matter so much? It comes down entirely to location. This earthquake struck almost precisely at the point where the Garlock Fault meets the San Andreas Fault. And that intersection is, without exaggeration, one of the most closely watched and most dangerous fault junctions in the entire state. As far as we can tell from the historical seismic record, this exact location has not experienced an earthquake at this magnitude at any point in at least the last 26 years. When a fault junction this significant, one that has stayed quiet for decades, suddenly produces a noticeable earthquake. That's exactly the kind of signal seismologists pay very close attention to, because it can hint at how stress is redistributing itself across the wider tectonic system. To really understand why this matters, we need to talk about how these two fault systems actually work. Both the San Andreas and the Garlock are what geologists call strike-slip faults, meaning the two sides slide horizontally past one another rather than one lifting over the other, as in a reverse fault, or pulling apart, as in a normal fault. The San Andreas is specifically a right lateral strike-slip fault, meaning if you were standing on one side watching the other move, it would appear to shift to your right. The Garlock runs the opposite way, as a left lateral strike-slip fault. On a map, it runs roughly east to west, cutting directly into the San Andreas. And right at that intersection, you can actually see the San Andreas physically bow and bend under the pressure. It helps to picture this like two enormous slabs of rock grinding past each other in opposite directions, year after year, decade after decade, locked together just enough at certain points that the motion doesn't happen smoothly. Instead, stress quietly builds up at those locked sections until it finally overcomes the friction holding everything in place and releases all at once as an earthquake, where the Garlock Fault runs into. The San Andreas, you essentially have two of these grinding systems meeting head-on, each one pushing and pulling on the other in a slightly different direction. That's exactly the kind of geometry that tends to produce complicated, unpredictable stress patterns. A bend matters enormously in earthquake science. Wherever a major fault develops a bend or kink along its length, stress tends to build up unevenly at that specific spot, rather than releasing smoothly the way it might along a straighter section. Geologists generally consider these bent sections prime candidates for a major rupture, precisely because the geometry itself makes it harder for accumulated stress to release gradually through smaller, more frequent earthquakes. The Garlock Fault specifically has been sitting locked and heavily loaded for an extremely long time. Based on the paleoseismic record, physical evidence of ancient earthquakes preserved in layers of soil and rock, Researchers have found strong evidence of past ruptures on the Garlock involving 2 to 3 meters of displacement, consistent with a major earthquake somewhere around magnitude 7.5. But here's the key detail. There's no record of the Garlock producing an earthquake anywhere near that size within the entire historic period, the years we actually have written or instrumental records for. Current estimates suggest the fault has likely gone without a major rupture for somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years, meaning an enormous amount of accumulated stress has had a very long time to build up, with nowhere left to go. That time frame means the Garlock has likely not produced a truly large earthquake since sometime around the medieval period in Europe, long before California had ever been mapped or settled. Faults like this don't simply forget about accumulated pressure over time. The rock on either side keeps grinding, keeps locking, and keeps storing strain energy, waiting for the moment the friction holding it in place finally gives way. This isn't the first time seismologists have flagged rising stress on the Garlock either. Back in 2019, a magnitude 6.4 foreshock struck near Ridgecrest, California, followed the very next day by a much larger magnitude, 7.1 earthquake, the strongest to hit California in more than 2 decades at that point. According to USGS calculations, that Ridgecrest sequence increased accumulated stress on the Garlock fault by roughly 30%. In other words, we already knew the Garlock was overdue for a major rupture before this recent Fraser Park earthquake, and Ridgecrest only made that pressure noticeably worse. Now bring in this new magnitude, 4.2 earthquake, striking directly at the junction where all that stress converges with the southern San Andreas, and you start to get a clearer picture of why seismologists are watching this so closely. It also helps to look at the broader historical pattern of major earthquakes in this general region going back more than 2 centuries. There was a massive magnitude 7.5 earthquake in 1857, known as the Fort Tejon earthquake, which struck close to the same area. Further south, San Diego experienced a magnitude 7.4 earthquake back in 1800. Then, in 1952, a magnitude 7.5 earthquake struck the region as well, though that particular quake occurred somewhat to the east of the main San Andreas fault line rather than directly on it. What's genuinely striking about the historical pattern is that most of the significant seismic activity over the past several decades has clustered to the east, out in the Mojave Desert and the broader eastern California shear zone, rather than directly on the San Andreas fault itself. The 2019 Ridgecrest sequence fits that same eastern pattern, and so does an earlier magnitude 7.1 earthquake back in 1999 and another significant quake in 1992. For a long stretch of time now, the western side of this system, the San Andreas fault itself, has stayed comparatively quiet. There's also an earlier historical event worth mentioning, a double earthquake sequence back in December of 1812 measuring roughly magnitude 7.5 and 7.1, which struck the same broader region of Southern California. Combined with the Fort Tejon earthquake decades later, these events form a rough historical outline of how often this particular stretch of the San Andreas has produced major ruptures over the past 2 centuries, and just how long it's now been since the last one occurred directly along the fault itself. That kind of long, quiet stretch is exactly what tends to worry seismologists the most, because it usually means stress is continuing to accumulate along a fault that hasn't had a major release in a very long time. There's also a broader pattern worth understanding here, the way seismic activity tends to shift geographically over time. Researchers have observed that earthquake activity in this general region can drift gradually from east to west and back again, playing out across time scales of 50 to 100 years or more. Given that recent major earthquakes, including the Ridgecrest sequence, have clustered toward the eastern side of the system, some researchers now believe the geographic pattern may be gradually shifting back toward the west, potentially placing increased future risk directly on the Garlock fault and the southern San Andreas fault, right where this new magnitude 4.2 earthquake just occurred. This kind of long-term geographic drift is one of the more difficult concepts in earthquake science for most people to really internalize, simply because it plays out across timescales far longer than a single human lifetime. In many cases, it's a bit like watching an extremely slow-moving pendulum swing back and forth across an entire region, spending decades favoring one cluster of faults, before gradually shifting its emphasis toward another. If that pattern genuinely does hold here, then the recent cluster of eastern activity, including Ridgecrest, may represent the tail end of one phase, with the tension now beginning to shift back toward this western junction between the Garlock and the San Andreas. None of this happened in isolation either. Earlier this summer, in June 2026, a magnitude 5.6 earthquake struck near Redwood Valley in Mendocino County, causing localized damage and knocking out power to thousands of customers across Northern California. And just weeks before this new Fraser Park earthquake, researchers published a major study modeling roughly 1,000 years of earthquake activity across the southern San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems. The research, led by a team including scientists from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, found that current stress levels along these fault systems are now at or above anything seen across the past 1,000 years of geological history. The study specifically highlighted an area known as Keijon Pass, describing it as a kind of earthquake gate, a critical junction that can determine whether a future rupture stays contained to a single fault or spreads across connected fault systems and grows dramatically larger as a result. That earthquake gate concept is genuinely important to understand because it changes how seismologists think about worst-case scenarios along this system. Historically, researchers often modeled the San Andreas and San Jacinto faults as largely separate systems, each capable of producing its own significant earthquake independently. This, newer research suggests that under the right stress conditions, a rupture that begins on one fault could potentially pass through Keijon Pass and continue onto the neighboring fault system, effectively linking the two together into a single, much larger earthquake than either fault could produce entirely on its own. That possibility significantly raises the upper bound of what a future worst-case earthquake in this region could actually look like. One of the researchers involved, a professor and director of the statewide California Earthquake Center at USC, pointed out that Southern California has gone without a major urban earthquake since the Northridge earthquake struck back in 1994. According to his own assessment, releasing the level of accumulated stress identified in this recent research would likely require an earthquake of magnitude 7 or larger. Researchers estimate that an earthquake of that size striking Southern California today could affect close to 24 million people across the greater Los Angeles metropolitan area and the Inland Empire, a population figure that gives you a real sense of just how significant a major rupture along this system could turn out to be. It's worth pausing on that comparison for a moment. The Northridge earthquake back in 1994, despite being significantly smaller than the scenarios described in this newer research, still caused billions of dollars in damage and remains one of the costliest natural disasters in United States history. A magnitude 7 or larger earthquake along the southern San Andreas system, striking a region now home to millions more residents and vastly more infrastructure than existed in 1994, would represent an entirely different scale of event altogether. Put all of these pieces together: the deeply overdue Garlock Fault, the added stress from the 2019 Ridgecrest sequence, a major new study confirming record-breaking stress levels across the southern San Andreas system, and now a magnitude 4.2 earthquake striking directly at this historically quiet fault junction. And you start to see why seismologists are treating this small earthquake as more significant than its modest size alone might suggest. To be completely clear here, a magnitude 4.2 earthquake is not by itself any kind of confirmed signal that a much larger earthquake is about to strike within days or even within months. Earthquake prediction with that level of precision simply isn't something current science is capable of doing reliably. What this earthquake does represent is a data point, a genuinely meaningful one, that adds to a much larger and steadily growing body of evidence, suggesting that stress across this particular fault system has been building for a long time, and that the region remains overdue for a major seismic event at some point in the future. It helps to think of individual earthquakes like this one less as standalone warnings and more as pixels contributing to a much larger, slowly forming picture. On its own, a single magnitude 4.2 earthquake tells researchers relatively little, but layer it on top of decades of paleoseismic data, recent stress modeling studies, known aftershock behavior from earlier ruptures like Ridgecrest, and the specific historically quiet location where this particular quake happened to strike. And the picture that emerges becomes considerably more informative than any single data point could ever be on its own. This is really how modern earthquake science works day to day, not through dramatic single predictions, but through the patient accumulation of exactly this kind of evidence over months, years, and decades. There's also an interesting pattern researchers have noted involving distant earthquakes, and how they can influence stress on fault systems far away from their own epicenter. This isn't a new or fringe idea. It's a well-established phenomenon within seismology, where the seismic waves generated by a large earthquake can travel outward and subtly load additional stress onto other faults located a considerable distance away. There's historical precedent for something like this. Back in 1811 and 1812, a powerful sequence of earthquakes struck the New Madrid region in the central United States. And right in the middle of that broader sequence, in March of 1812, California experienced its own significant double earthquake sequence measuring roughly magnitude 7.4 and 7.1. Some researchers have pointed to this kind of long-distance timing correlation as evidence that seismic events across different regions may sometimes be more connected than most people realize, even across enormous distances. To be clear, this kind of stress transfer generally works over much smaller distances than the gap between the central United States and California, and most seismologists would treat a connection across that particular distance as a loose historical curiosity rather than a firmly established causal link. Still, the broader underlying mechanism, waves from a large earthquake subtly redistributing stress onto other faults, is genuinely well documented at more regional scales, and it forms part of the reason seismologists pay attention to global earthquake activity as a whole rather than only tracking whatever is happening within a single state or country. More recently, the same year, a powerful double earthquake sequence struck along a major fault system in Venezuela on the very same day that Northern California experienced its magnitude 5.6 earthquake near Redwood Valley. That Venezuelan earthquake sequence proved to be genuinely historic in scale, with thousands of people still reported missing, and several thousand confirmed deaths in its aftermath, making it one of the most destructive seismic disasters the region has experienced in generations. Around that same period, a magnitude 6.1 earthquake also struck near Cuba, and a separate magnitude 6 earthquake struck down in Baja California, a region that has in certain documented cases shown a loose connection to seismic activity further north in mainland California, although this connection does not hold true in every instance. Taken individually, none of these separate earthquakes prove any kind of direct, guaranteed cause and effect relationship with what just happened at Fraser Park. But taken together, as part of a much broader global pattern of unusually active seismic behavior across multiple connected fault systems this year, they paint a picture of a planet that currently appears to be releasing an unusually large amount of accumulated tectonic stress across several regions at once. So, what does all of this actually mean going forward? Based on the current body of evidence, several fault systems across California appear to be under unusually high levels of accumulated stress. At the same time, the Garlock Fault remains significantly overdue for a major rupture, potentially in the range of magnitude 7.5 or greater. The southern San Andreas Fault has gone an especially long time without a major release, directly along its own fault line, and recent research indicates its accumulated stress levels are now comparable to, or possibly exceeding anything recorded across the past 1,000 years. Northern California is showing its own signs of increased activity as well, highlighted by that magnitude 5.6 earthquake near Redwood Valley back in June. And the Bay Area, home to several major fault systems, including the Hayward Fault, the Green Valley Fault, and the Calaveras Fault, remains widely considered overdue for a significant earthquake of its own, a risk made even more complicated by the existence of hidden, previously undocumented faults, like the West Napa Fault, which wasn't even formally recognized by researchers until it produced a magnitude 6 earthquake back in 2014. That West Napa Fault example is worth sitting with for a moment because it highlights something genuinely humbling about earthquake science as a whole. Even with decades of detailed mapping, satellite monitoring, and ground-based instrumentation covering the state, researchers can still be caught off guard by faults that weren't previously known to exist at all, faults that only reveal themselves the moment they actually rupture. That reality alone is a strong argument for taking earthquake preparedness seriously everywhere across California, not only in these specific zones currently receiving the most attention from researchers and the media. Given everything currently converging within this one fault system, there's even a possibility, though not necessarily the single most likely outcome, that a future major earthquake could involve some form of connected rupture across both the Garlock Fault and the southern San Andreas Fault, either happening simultaneously or in very close succession to one another. That kind of linked multi-fault rupture tends to produce a significantly larger and more complex earthquake than either fault rupturing entirely on its own would produce. Seismologists have started paying much closer attention to these kinds of multi-fault cascading rupture scenarios in recent years, partly because several major earthquakes around the world over the past couple of decades have demonstrated that a rupture beginning on one fault can, under the right stress conditions, jump onto a neighboring fault and continue propagating far beyond what older models once assumed was possible. That shift in scientific understanding is a big part of why the Cajon Pass earthquake gate research carries so much weight. It's not simply describing two separate faults sitting near each other, it's describing a specific structural weak point that could determine whether a future earthquake stays contained or grows into something considerably larger and more damaging than initial models might predict. None of this is meant to cause panic. Earthquakes of this size happen regularly across California, and the vast majority come and go without any lasting consequences at all. But this particular earthquake, given its precise location directly at one of the most heavily monitored and clearly overdue fault junctions in the entire state, combined with everything else we currently know about accumulated stress across the wider Southern California fault network, is exactly the kind of event that responsible earthquake preparedness should take seriously. More small but meaningful piece of evidence in that much larger ongoing story. Whether the next major earthquake ends up striking the Garlock Fault, the southern San Andreas, somewhere in Northern California, or the Bay Area, being genuinely prepared matters, regardless of exactly where or when it eventually happens. If you live anywhere in California or in any other region prone to significant earthquakes, Now is a genuinely good time to review your own personal emergency plan. Keep a basic emergency kit ready to go at all times, including enough food, water, and basic medical supplies to last at least several days. A hand crank radio can prove genuinely valuable if the power grid goes down for an extended period, and having a reliable backup battery pack along with a portable solar charging setup can help keep essential devices running if regular power access becomes unavailable for a while. Beyond the basic supply kit, it's worth thinking through a few practical details ahead of time rather than during an actual emergency. Know the safest spots inside your own home to shelter during shaking, generally under a sturdy piece of furniture, away from windows, tall bookshelves, and anything that could realistically fall. If you live in an older building, it's worth finding out whether it's been retrofitted to modern seismic standards, since older unreinforced structures tend to fare considerably worse during strong shaking than newer, code-compliant buildings. Agree on a simple communication plan with your family ahead of time as well, including an out-of-area contact everyone can reach if local phone networks become overloaded or unreliable in the immediate aftermath of a major earthquake, which is extremely common in the first hour or two after any significant seismic event. It's also worth signing up directly for regional earthquake early warning alerts if you haven't already, since these systems can occasionally provide several seconds, and in some cases closer to a full minute of advance warning before strong shaking actually arrives at your specific location, depending on how far you happen to be from the epicenter. Even a few seconds of warning can be enough time to drop, take cover, and protect yourself before the strongest shaking hits. And it's often enough time for automated systems to slow trains, open elevator doors, and pause sensitive industrial equipment as well. Pattern, refine their stress models, and get a clearer picture of exactly what this earthquake means for the surrounding fault system. I'll be watching the USGS data closely over the coming days, along with any updated statements from the researchers involved in that recent stress modeling study, and I'll bring you a full follow-up the moment there's anything genuinely new to report. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any future updates, since I cover breaking earthquake activity like this almost every single day. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.